and servant. Warrior love continues in the New Testament. In the Gospel of Matthew, a Roman centurion comes to Jesus to ask for aid for his beloved servant. The Greek word used to describe the servant is pais, a term regularly used in Hellenistic literature to designate the younger beloved of same-sex love. The fact that a Roman in this scene pleads to a Jew would have been seen as unconventional, particularly since as a soldier, his role was to rule, control, and dominate. This gives us character insight into how little this centurion regards his social norms. Jesus' response is interesting, explaining that in all of Israel, he has not seen such faithfulness. Now, at first glance, this response can easily be interpreted as Jesus approving of the soldier's faith in Jesus. But why not suggest that Jesus' reply may have actually been about the soldier's faithfulness to his slave, remarking on a love for a beloved that risks humiliation and danger to restore the beloved to wholeness? I can certainly see Jesus relating to love in that way. Within the context of warrior love, as well as the fact that centurions weren't permitted to marry women during their terms of service, Jesus' endorsement of at least certain forms of same-sex love becomes evident here. Jesus approves of love that includes unswerving loyalty and care of lovers for their beloveds. He did not shun his gay believers, but instead help them. Now, before we get to our last
History Channel. Discover a sacred object coveted by leaders such as Attila the Hun, Charlemagne, and Hitler. Said to be imbued with mystical powers, it played a part in some of the greatest conquests of history. And about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? A witness said, this one is calling for Elijah. Immediately a bystander ran to get a sponge. He soaked it in wine, and putting it on a reed, offered him a drink. But the rest said, wait, let us see if Elijah comes to save him. Then Jesus cried out again in a loud voice and gave up his spirit. The crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth in 33 AD is one of the most important events in the history of mankind, a point from which time itself is dated. For 2 billion Christians, Jesus was the Son of God in the form of a man, and he died on the cross for one reason: redemption of the soul. This belief is so revered that the instruments of his execution have taken on sacred Christian significance. The cross, the nails which pierced his hands, his crown of thorns, and a Roman warrior's lance which pierced his side. Their importance has made them objects of desire and obsession by some of the most powerful and influential men in history. It is now widely accepted that there was a man named Jesus crucified around 33 AD. The Christian sources are the 4 Gospels of Saints Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the central event in each is the trial and execution of Jesus, known as the Passion. The crucifixion scenes in Matthew, Mark, and Luke differ dramatically from that told by John. He alone described the actions of the Roman centurions ordered to break the legs of the condemned men to make sure that they died before the Sabbath. When they came to Jesus, he was already dead, so they did not break his legs. But one soldier thrust a lance into his side, and immediately blood and water flowed out, according to the Gospel of John.
The story of the lance piercing Jesus' side is almost certainly historical, because scholars examining the Gospels believe that the most historical parts of the Gospel narratives are the so-called passion narratives. This was the central episode in the life of Jesus, and the memory of this was pressed upon every early Christian. And so the soldier piercing the side of Jesus is in fact likely to be an accurate incident in the account of the execution.
If the accounts of the centurion in John's Gospel are true, we now know him by the name Longinus.
By the 5th and 6th centuries, an apocryphal gospel known as the Acts of Pilate combine the lance episode found in John's Gospel with the Gospel's account of a centurion standing beneath the cross, giving him the name Longinus.
These sources are so much later than the gospel accounts or even the actual episode of the crucifixion of Jesus. This name is not likely to have a historical basis. In fact, it was probably a common Roman name that was invented by the early church.
Legend has it that when Longinus pierced Christ's side, the warrior had an infected eye. But Christ's blood splashed on his face, and his eye was cured, and Longinus became a Christian. So began the first of many legends connected to the lance.
In the 13th century, a Dominican by the name of Jacopus da Voragine gathered all the legends dealing with Longinus, and it is from his account that we really get a detailed, colorful story, which in fact is what you find represented in the art of the West.
Whoever that centurion was, and whatever actually happened on Mount Calvary, certain facts remain. The man we call Longinus was a soldier in the Roman army, and his finely forged weapon would have been well earned and well cared for. The centurion belonged to a division based at the Roman fortress in Jerusalem. Here in the Roman armory, he would have deposited the lance that pierced Christ's side. What did it look like?
What the actual lance looked like, we don't know for sure, but based upon studies of similar artifacts, the lance would have been about 6 feet long. It would have been a wooden shaft. At one end would have been a metal point that might have been up to about 1 foot long. The pilum, as it was called, was designed for throwing at short range, but it could be used for thrusting or stabbing, as it was in this case.
In 66 AD, the Jews seized the Roman armory. Early Christian traditions say the lance was delivered into safe hands, hidden and protected during the Jewish revolt and subsequent Roman purgings. "80 years later, in 135 AD, Emperor Hadrian sought to destroy the last relics of Christ and ordered the total destruction of Jerusalem. All Jews were expelled from the city. The Christians, who had been tolerated in the city as a religious minority, were indiscriminately slaughtered. What actually happened to the lance is not known. What is known is that the Roman Catholic Church kept the remains of martyred saints, but Christ left no relics. With the passing of time, the legend of the Holy Lance grew, perpetuated by the Church. Soon this inanimate object became a mystical symbol of the power of Christian belief. Before long, even the mightiest rulers of the world were seduced by this simple myth. Thus, the Holy Lance became an object of unbelievable obsession. The location of the lance that pierced the side of Christ remained unknown for nearly 300 years after his death. Then, during the greatest archaeological expedition of the ancient world, the excavation of Jerusalem, the lance was supposedly found. The expedition was ordered by the Emperor Constantine after his mother Helena had a dream in which she was led to the holy sites of Jesus of Nazareth.
There was a temple of Venus in the city. Helena was taken there and she ordered its demolition. And under the foundations of the Temple of Venus, they found a rock-cut tomb, which she believed and others believed was the tomb of Jesus, where, of course, is today the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
It was said that Helena's expedition also discovered the actual artifacts used 300 years earlier in the execution of Jesus. The actual crown of thorns, some of the nails, and the wooden cross on which he died.
How did she decipher which one was the true cross of Christ? Well, she had a corpse brought in of a dead man and applied the cross to the corpse. The first cross did nothing, the second cross did nothing, and the third cross caused the dead man to rise up and he was revived. And so therefore it was seen as a divine validation that this was indeed the true cross of Christ.
As improbable as it sounds, this event was confirmed by early Christian witnesses and dutifully recorded by subsequent church historians. To the people of the time, the magical powers of holy relics were believed without question, and visions of them were often part of religious conversion. Prior to the Great Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, the Emperor Constantine reported that he looked toward the midday sun and saw a cross of light. Under it were the words, "By this, conquer." Constantine adopted the cross as a symbol of his rule, embraced Christianity, and became ruler of the entire Roman Empire.
I tend to think that the conversion was a genuine religious experience because I don't think that there were many practical reasons in 312 AD for Constantine to convert to Christianity. The number of Christians in the empire was very small at that time. Christians were not politically powerful or well-connected. There were few Christians in the army at this time.
Helena returned to Rome with many treasures, but not the Holy Lance. But sacred objects were not items to be paraded around like war trophies. Sacrilege was a serious sin, and even the mother of the emperor feared eternal punishment. Instead, Helena and Constantine ordered an empire-wide church-building program as an act of devotion. Pilgrimages to these holy sites were encouraged. It is from one of these pilgrims that we have the first written account of the location of the lance.
In the 6th century, a pilgrim visiting Jerusalem by the name of Antoninus says that he went to the Basilica of Mount Sion in Jerusalem and there saw the Holy Lance erected in such a way that it formed a cross. And this is the first time you hear of the lance mentioned by a pilgrim and recorded in a recording that has survived to this day.
Constantine did not take the lance, but to emphasize his divine rulership, he had the sacred nails converted into symbols of the empire. One was cast into a crown. The other was made into a second lance. According to tradition, Constantine used this lance to draw out the boundaries of his new capital city, Constantinople.
The lance is connected in some sources with the foundation of Constantinople, which would then become the capital of the entire empire. and would survive for 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Empire, become known to us as the Byzantine Empire.
The new lance and crown became sacred relics denoting power. Constantine brought them to his new capital at Constantinople, which proved to be wise. When the Western Roman Empire fell to the barbarian tribes, their leaders, from Alaric the Bold to Attila the Hun, demanded the lance as part of their peace treaty with Rome. Even pagan warriors believed in the mystical powers of the lance. But the leaders and popes of the 5th century did not hand over either of the two lances regarded as holy relics. Both remained under the watchful eye of the Byzantine emperors until the Persians sacked Jerusalem in 614 AD.
When Jerusalem was captured in the year 614, and someone managed to break off the tip of the blade of the lance and escaped to Constantinople, when the Byzantine emperor Heraclius recaptured Jerusalem in the year 670, he restored the relics to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But the tip of the blade, which had been broken off earlier in that century, was left in Constantinople.
The shaft and the neck of the first lance resided in Jerusalem, but the tip was taken to St. Sophia Cathedral and later to the Chapel of Pharos in Constantinople. As long as the lance remained in Constantinople, the emperor was seen as God's appointed ruler on earth. Charlemagne was proclaimed the first king of the Holy Roman Empire in 800 AD. One enduring symbol of his rule was his possession of the Holy Lance. He was the first in a long line of rulers to use the lance to hold his empire together. In centuries to come, it would aid Saxon kings of England, Henry I of Germany, and Otto I of Austria. All would carry the lance into battle, all would win great victories, and all would pay homage to the power of the holy relic, and they would fight to the death to keep it. 25 years before Charlemagne became king, the Pope gave him a lance said to have been carried by Constantine in battle, the Lance of St. Maurice. Charlemagne believed it was the actual lance of Christ, wielding divine power.
The emperor who possessed the relics of Christ, the Holy Lance, and the part of the Holy Cross, the guarantee that he is always victorious, because in the end of the world, Christ will be the Christ of the whole world. And the emperor had also the function to defend the empire of Christ against all enemies. And therefore, it had been believed that he will be always victorious because he owns the original arms of Christ.
This lance had a distinct 7th century design, making it an unlikely candidate as the original lance of Constantine. But to the people of Charlemagne's empire, that didn't matter. The Pope said it was the Holy Lance, and it had shavings from the holy nails brought from Jerusalem by Helena. To them, it was truly sacred.
Just by merely touching the original relic, in a way, you kind of clone the relic, and it becomes, that which has touched the original itself becomes holy. And so there's this profusion of lances, profusion of nails.
That sacredness was enhanced by Charlemagne's phenomenal battle victories against the Saxons and the Muslims. He carried the lance through the conquest of Jerusalem, and his troops believed that they were unbeatable so long as they fought with it. Then one day, while riding across a stream, Charlemagne is said to have dropped the holy blade. His soldiers thought this was a terrible omen, and Charlemagne died soon after, in 814. After Charlemagne's death, the Holy Lance became the trophy of kings throughout Europe. In the early 900s, it appeared among the treasures of the Saxon king in England, who sold it to an Italian count. The count, in turn, gave it as a gift to King Rudolf of Burgundy. Rudolf, knowing its importance to the Holy Roman Empire, shrewdly ransomed it. He made a deal with Henry I of Germany, trading the Lance of St. Maurice for the entire province of Bâle, Switzerland.
To give you an idea of the importance, when the King of Burgundy gave the Holy Lance to the King of the Holy Roman Empire, Henry I gave instead, in exchange, to the King of Burgundy, the city of Bâle, now in Switzerland, Bâle on the Rhine. So a whole city was a prize for the importance of the Holy Lance, that you can understand only by medieval thinking.
The lance was, in the early Germanic world, a sign and symbol of rulership. The ruler was, in some sense, God's representative on earth. And because of this, a weapon which is a symbol of rulership and is conferred upon the new ruler at the time of his accession in a religious ceremony. The weapon becomes a religious symbol as well as being a symbol of government and rulership.
Henry I is regarded as the founder of modern Germany. He became the first in a long line of German kings and emperors to covet the lance. Henry believed he had been chosen by God to be the rightful heir to the Holy Roman Empire, but the Pope did not. To legitimize his ascension with the people, Henry proudly displayed the lance. So began a struggle between secular and spiritual rulers that would last for centuries. Henry sought to validate his rule by accumulating holy relics, and he built a special chapel to house his collection. Upon his death, the lance passed on to his son Otto. At battles throughout Europe, Otto prayed with the lance in hand that his army would be victorious. His success in war against the Hungarians and subsequently against the Poles put him first in line for the mantle of Holy Roman Emperor.
In 955, he won a shattering victory over the Hungarian invaders, and he crushed their power. And already the rumors that he was more than a king and should be honored with a kind of imperial office had begun to be voiced within Germany.
Otto I thanked God for the victory, and he believed that the victory was given to him because he had the Holy Lance in his hands. And that is also interesting that Otto I gave afterwards a copy of the Holy Lance to the kings of Hungary and to kings of Poland. Both were afterwards friends of Otto I.
Otto was well aware that there was another lance in the east. Yet this lance of St. Maurice had a life of its own. Otto's grandson, Otto III, further enhanced its importance by inserting a nail allegedly from the true cross of Christ in it. Again, it was carried into battle, and Holy Roman emperors were victorious, and the Holy Lance became the divine symbol of Germanic power. In 1250, during the reign of Frederick II, this Holy Lance was moved to Nuremberg, where it stayed for 550 years. All that remained was for Charles IV in 1350 to engrave on the lance what all his subjects believed, that this was the true lance and nail of Christ. And yet it seemed that whenever there was a great battle to decide the fate of an empire in Europe, there appeared a Holy Lance on the winning side. All at once there seemed to be a great proliferation of Holy Lances throughout Christendom. In 1095, the Emperor of Constantinople wrote a letter to Pope Urban II, requesting military assistance in his war with the Turks. At a Congress of Kings, the Pope used this letter to attack the idle rule of 11th century nobility, calling them blasphemers and plunderers. The Pope challenged them to go forward boldly as knights of Christ and save Jerusalem. Thus, an army of Norman cavaliers hurried to save the Holy Land. So began the Great Crusades.
We can sum up chivalry as the attempt by religious authorities and others to tame the gangster nobility that normally ran or had run in the 10th and 11th centuries, roughshod over the landscape of Western Europe. And the attempt to tame them was giving them a noble ideal and an idea of a way of life. And one part of this was expressed in literary models and a dreamlike religious quest is one of the constant themes.
The kings of Europe responded and sent thousands of armed horsemen to save the Holy Lands and relics of Christ from the Turks. Ahead lay heat, famine, disease, and countless hardships, but they marched on from as far away as England. When the Crusaders reached Constantinople, the emperor told them to go home. They were not wanted. But the nights went on, and by the winter of 1097 laid siege to the ancient Christian town of Antioch, held by the Turks. As weeks turned into months, the situation looked grim. A large Muslim army was marching to help lift the siege. Food and supplies were running low. Then, in May 1098, there came a break. A traitor secretly led the Crusaders into town. By the morning, it was theirs. But suddenly a new Muslim army arrived and the Crusaders themselves were besieged. Tired, hungry, and outnumbered, they were at the edge of despair. Then a soldier stepped forward, claiming he had had a vision from St. Andrew, showing him where to find the Holy Lance of Christ. The story says that the soldier dug in the basement of St. Peter's Cathedral and found an ancient lance. Holding it high, the outnumbered, starving, ragtag Crusaders of Antioch attacked their formidable foe and miraculously won.
Whether they would have achieved that without the inspiring, encouraging, inspiriting reassurance given by the discovery of a Holy Lance is doubtful. They were outnumbered. They were facing a fresh army pretty much on its own terrain. They themselves had traveled thousands of miles to get there. And so it was an extraordinary achievement, and only the passion and enthusiasm of religious fervor helps us, I think, adequately to understand it.
The victory was attributed to the power of the lance, which the Crusaders believed was the actual lance of Christ. But among them was a papal ambassador who had once seen the original lance of Longinus in Constantinople. Wisely, the ambassador kept his thoughts to himself, and a year later, the holy city of Jerusalem fell to the Christian army. Soon after, this new lance became the focus of political intrigue, and doubts arose about its authenticity. But the leaders of the Crusades ignored all skeptics and offered the so-called Lance of Antioch to the Emperor of Constantinople. The emperor must have been surprised and amused by these glorious claims. He already owned what he believed was the Holy Lance. Nevertheless, he accepted this new one. The appearance of this Lance of Antioch caused a great outcry in Armenia. The Armenian Christians claimed to own yet another Holy Lance, and they believed it was the true relic of the crucifixion. Later, Syrian and Armenian writers devised a series of myths and legends to explain the confusion. Eventually, all the various lances of Longinus, Constantine, and Antioch wound up in Constantinople. In 1204 AD, Crusaders stormed the city, and the lances became the trophies of Baldwin II. In 1241, he sold all the holy relics, including the tip of the lance of Longinus, to King Louis of France. Louis built a special reliquary in Paris for this collection, the stunningly beautiful Sainte-Chapelle. Here, the tip stayed until the French Revolution. The broken shaft remained in Constantinople. The lance of Constantine and the lance of Antioch disappeared, both lost to history. When the Turks overran Constantinople in 1453, the shaft of the lance fell into their possession. In 1492, Pope Innocent VIII made an offer to the Turkish Sultan for its return.
The Sultan and the Pope made a deal. The Pope happened to have the Sultan's brother as a prisoner, and the Sultan had the lance. They made a fair exchange, and ever since that time, the lance has purportedly been in the possession of the Vatican and is found in one of the great four piers at the crossing of St. Peter's Basilica.
The Pope's acquisition marked the end of an era. Belief in the power of relics, which ruled people during the Middle Ages, was passing. The age of mysticism and magic was giving way to the age of reason and enlightenment. By the 19th century, however, the excitement of the Renaissance waned, and the bleak reality of industrialism turned thoughts back to the glorious age of chivalry. Once again, people believed in great quests for mystical grails and lances. The Holy Roman Empire, begun by King Charlemagne in 800 AD, ended 1,000 years later when Napoleon conquered Austria in 1800. The remnants of the empire fell to the Habsburg family, who had ruled the empire since the 13th century. For another 100 years, they presided over the ancient house, protecting the battle trophies of Christianity. In 1914, the Lance of St. Maurice, the last symbol of divine rule, seemed a worthless relic. Yet it would soon become a valued talisman of the 20th century.
There's a German poet writing around 1800 who says something like, if the Middle Ages was a night, so nonetheless it was a night filled with stars. There was a radical re-evaluation of the Middle Ages.
Man lives not by reason alone. For 1,000 years, Christianity ruled the Western world, and its relics were used as the symbols of rule. But when the Roman Catholics lost their power, people sought a new cause to identify with and rally around. After the First World War, that cause was nationalism.
The national identity of all Western European people changed at the beginning of the 19th century because Romanticism made the deep roots of one's national past a crucial part of what one should study, what one should know about, and what was the source of one's values and whatever was distinctive in one's national past.
For many, that meant a revival of interest in the Middle Ages. The exploits of brave knights who risked death for the sake of honor and country were romanticized. In literature, music, and culture, 19th century Europeans wallowed in Romanticism. The origins of many romantic tales were found in the great legends of the Holy Roman Empire. One artist embodied the spirit of this age, Richard Wagner.
There's around 1200, and in the opening years of the 13th century, a kind of literary renaissance in Germany. The first great renaissance of the German language and of German poetry and literature. Wagner draws on that, exploits it, uses it, and takes its energy and tries to create a Germanic mythology that will inspire his operas, but also will be a part of the self-perception of the German people.
It was from a story set in the Middle Ages that Richard Wagner composed Parsifal, whose main theme involved Teutonic knights in search of the Holy Grail. The key to their success was the ownership of the Holy Lance, the Lance of St. Maurice, symbol of rule for the Holy Roman Emperor. In 1912, during a performance of Parsifal in Vienna, an unemployed artist sat transfixed, absorbed in the exhilarating magic of past Germanic greatness. His name was Adolf Hitler. Hitler was very familiar with the lance in the Habsburg collection. After all, it had been owned by all his heroes, such as Frederick Barbarossa and Otto the Great, the emperors of the First Reich. Men who for Hitler embodied the greatness of the Germanic people. 26 years later, Hitler rode into Vienna to claim the lance for the Third Reich.
For Hitler, the treasure of the Holy Roman Empire was important to show to the people the tradition of the Holy Roman Empire, to his own idea of a German empire in his sense. Therefore, he wanted to have the lance as a symbol of the tradition going from 10th century to the end of 20th century.
The Nazis, I think, went back to these relics and looked at them in their original meaning. That they were not just little pieces you put in glass cages, but they radiated some sort of power, or you could gain strength, or you could express strength by being closely associated with them.
The Holy Roman Empire lasted 1,000 years. Hitler's Third Reich was planned to last another 1,000 years. But unlike the First Reich, it would be neither holy nor Roman. Hitler despised Christianity and feared Catholicism. His rule would take the form expressed by his favorite philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche conceived the doctrine of will to power, a race of supermen rising above the rabble and ruling with an iron fist. He found the Christian belief of turning the other cheek ridiculous and described Jesus of Nazareth as an idiot who deserved to be killed by the Romans. In 1938, Hitler took possession of the lance believed to have stabbed Jesus, the Jew. In Hitler's hands, the lance would not be a symbol of redemption and divine rulership, but a symbol for ethnic cleansing and tyranny. The man in charge of Nazi genocide, Heinrich Himmler, regarded his work with the SS as a quasi-religious quest. Himmler's obsession with Germanic racial purity led to the setting up of a bureau designated to make scientific studies of all facets of Germanic identity.
Himmler took this, as we know, not only serious personally, in terms of actually participating in these events, making an effort to make sure that everything was done right, but in terms of finding funds, finding researchers, serious archaeologists, historians, by the dozens, to dig up historical sites, find relics, find the bones of Henry I.
Himmler greatly admired Henry I, the founder of Germany, and he believed that he was Henry's direct descendant. Himmler took over the church where Henry had kept the lance and other sacred relics. Here, he organized SS-style religious ceremonies. At the famous triangular castle of Wawelsburg, Himmler fitted out the bedrooms in the style of the eras of his favorite German emperors. He slept in the Henry I room. When Hitler seized the lance and other Habsburg treasures in Vienna, Himmler hoped that Hitler would give him the lance. All he received was a copy. The real one was taken to the St. Catherine Cathedral in Nuremberg, the city where it had resided during the First Reich.
Nuremberg had an important place throughout German history, particularly in the most powerful decades and centuries of the Holy Roman Empire. It was the seat, it was the capital of Germany. And as the name indicates, Holy Roman Empire, the First Reich.
The Lance of St. Maurice was exhibited at rallies held in Nuremberg during 1938 and 39. As the war intensified in the 1940s and Allied bombers began targeting Nuremberg, extraordinary measures were taken to protect the lance. It was moved from the Church of the Holy Ghost to a bank vault. When that proved inadequate, a special underground vault was built 500 feet beneath Nuremberg Castle.
I can't see this as an expression of just being concerned about the material value. The Nazis felt they needed to protect so they could be used again once the war is over, and they would rise again, or the Germans would rise again, with or without the Nazis.
On April 20th, 1945, General Mark Clark of the U.S. 7th Army discovered the lance and the Habsburg treasures under the Nuremberg fortress. The nightmare was finally over. Adolf Hitler's Third Reich had fallen. On the 7th of January, 1946, the Lance of St. Maurice was returned to the Habsburg Palace in Vienna, where it remains today. A copy of the lance, made by Otto the Great and given to the Polish people, is still at Krakow Cathedral. The Lance of Antioch, which inspired the Crusaders in 1098, has been lost to history, as has the Lance of Constantine. The lance of the Armenian people is now a cultural treasure there, and the shaft of the Lance of Longinus is still at the Vatican. During the French Revolution, the tip of the Lance of Longinus was moved from Saint-Chapelle to the Bibliothèque Nationale, then lost. But there's a footnote to the story.
When Pope Benedict XIV was on the papal throne, he sent an emissary to Paris to see exactly what that tip of the lance blade looked like and to have a drawing made to its exact dimensions. This was brought back to Rome, and he was satisfied that the two formed one blade.
And so a simple lance of wood and iron was transformed through 2,000 years of history from an object of pious devotion to a symbol of evil power, and back again. It's a cycle often found on our journeys in search of history.